Hello, everyone. Happy Thursday. Thank you so much for tuning in. My name is Sarah Siegel, and on behalf of Harvard Bookstore, I'm excited to welcome you to tonight's event with JOHN DELLA VOLPE discussing his book, Fight, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. He is joined tonight by David Hogg in a conversation moderated by Rachel Janfaza. Through virtual events like tonight's, Harvard Bookstore continues to bring authors and their work to our community and our new digital community during these challenging times. Every week, we're hosting events here on Zoom, and as always, our event schedule appears on our website at harvard.com/events, where you can sign up for our email newsletter and browse our shelves from home. This evening's discussion will conclude with some time for your questions. If you have a question at any time during the talk today, go to the Q&A button on your screen and we will get through as many as time allows. You should also be able to access closed captioning by clicking the button on your screen as well. If you'd like to buy a copy of Fight, there will be a link in the chat where you can purchase it. All sales through this link support Harvard Bookstore, so thank you for your support of community spaces like your local bookstore. There will also be a link to donate in the chat if you would like to give additional support to Harvard Bookstore. Your purchases and financial contributions make this virtual author series possible, and now more than ever supports the future of a landmark independent bookstore. Thank you for tuning in support of our authors and the incredible staff of booksellers at Harvard Bookstore. We sincerely appreciate your support now and always. And finally, as you may have experienced in virtual gatherings, technical issues may arise. If they do, we will do our best to resolve them as quickly as possible. Thank you for your patience and understanding. And now I am so pleased to introduce tonight's speakers. JOHN DELLA VOLPE is the Director of Polling at the Harvard Kennedy School Institute of Politics, where he has led the Institute's polling initiatives on understanding American youth since 2000. The Washington Post referred to John as one of the world's leading authorities on global sentiment, opinion, and influence, especially among millennials and in the age of digital and social media. John appears regularly on MSNBC's Morning Joe, and his insights on the millennial generation are found in national media outlets in the US and abroad, including The Daily Show with Trevor Noah. John is joined tonight by David Hogg. David was thrust into the world of activism by the largest school shooting in American history, and he has since become one of the most compelling voices of his generation. Passionate in his advocacy to end gun violence, David's mission of increasing voter participation, civic engagement, and activism embraces a range of issues. This conversation will be moderated by Rachel Janfaza. Rachel is an associate writer for CNN Politics in Washington, D.C., covering youth political culture and everything related to young voters in US politics. Rachel is CNN's first writer on the politics team dedicated to the youth beat. Tonight, they're discussing Fight, How Gen Z is Channeling Their Fear and Passion to Save America. Since they were born, Generation Z, those born from the late 1990s to early 2000s, have been faced with an onslaught of turmoil, destruction, and instability unprecedented in modern history. They are more stressed, anxious, and depressed than previous generations. But Gen Z has not buckled under this weight. On the contrary, they have organized around issues from gun control to racial and environmental justice to economic equity, becoming more politically engaged than their elders and showing a unique willingness to disrupt the status quo. In Fight, Della Volpe draws on his vast experience to show the largest forces shaping Gen Zers' lives, the issues they care most about, and how they are, despite older Americans' efforts to label them as overly sensitive, lazy, and entitled, rising to the unprecedented challenge of their time to take control of their country and our future. Without further ado, I will turn things over to our speakers. John, David, and Rachel, the virtual podium is yours.
Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. We're excited to get started, and I'm going to ask John and David some questions. And if you have any questions at any point, please feel free to put them in the chat, and we'll have time at the end for Q&A, but we can sprinkle them throughout as well. So to get started, John, I know you've been studying youth politics and everything pertaining to young people's sentiment, both when it comes to their politics, their mental health, and daily life and culture for over 20 years now. So what prompted you to write this book at this point?
Thanks, Rachel, and thanks, Sarah, to the Harvard Bookstore for hosting this event. Sorry, we can't be together, but I appreciate everyone joining. Yeah, Rachel, it was 42 semesters ago now, 21 years ago, where two sophomores at Harvard College asked if they could do a survey to try to understand the difference between voting and community service. They looked at the basically the voting habits of my generation, Generation X, in the 1990s, and were not impressed. Only about a third of young people voted in that 1996 election, and they came to the IOP and they asked, why don't other members of our generation understand the older millennials? If we vote and if we volunteer and vote, we can make progress and change that much quicker. So that was like the beginning of this project and my interest in studying young Americans. And for roughly 15, 16 years, Rachel, I would spend every single summer, we conduct a couple polls a year at Harvard with undergraduates, but I'd spend every summer traveling across the country asking a similar set of questions. What do I need to understand? How is life? What keeps you up at night? What makes you happy? What unites us as Americans? And the first town hall I did in the summer of 2017, it was in Ohio. And for the first time was confronted with a very different set of answers to those same questions. Rather than young people telling me that they felt optimistic or they felt like what connected all of us as Americans is opportunity, I heard a very different story. I heard what connects us is fear. And I'd probe and I'd hear, it's fear of everything. Fear for our children, fear of our climate, fear for those who think or look or act differently than others, just this fear rising. And this was about a month or two before Charlottesville, right? This is in the first few months of the Trump administration. And I began at that point to believe that I just needed to completely reshape how I was thinking about this subject, that we were seeing a generational shift happen between millennials and this younger group of Gen Zers just coming of age, and kind of deeply concerned and not afraid to show it. So I began to pay closer attention. It was in my head to think differently about this generation, but the book idea really started to come together, frankly, inspired by David and March for Our Lives. A couple things happened. I saw a significant shift in our polling before and after Trump, before and after the tragedy of Parkland. And I was tracking that. And it culminated, which we'll talk about hopefully in some detail, with record participation in the 2018 midterm elections. And I knew at that point that this fear that I'd been picking up and listening for over the 18 months between 17 and the election was turning into something much bigger than any of us could have imagined. This generation, in large part led by David and his high school friends and many others, double the level of participation of any other generation when they were that age, just doubled it and changed the landscape forever. And that's when I went out and started actually putting this book together. It was about 3 years ago today.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I know that, so John, David, and I have spoken about this generation and what makes it unique for a long time now. But I want to focus a bit on, John, your key idea in the book and what you just talked about how there have been so many perpetual crises that have come to define this generation as we've grown up. David and I are both members of Gen Z, although I'm right on the cusp. And, you know, in the beginning of the book, David, in your foreword, you write, and I'm quoting you here, "We are a generation forged by trauma and loss, but we are not defeated." So I'd love to hear from you both, starting with David. What makes the trauma and loss, in your opinion, of Gen Z different from the tragedy that's been faced by prior generations?
I would say one of the main differences is just how much more interconnected we are and how it's enabled us to actively mobilize more quickly around, bad things. Every generation has bad things that happen to them in one way or another. I think the difference for Gen Z is that for us, we're able to connect with people around the country at a moment's notice and mobilize faster than ever before or ever was possible before, thanks to things like Twitter and Facebook and different forms of social media. So that when you are just a group of students in, Parkland, Florida, that just went through a horrific school shooting, you can immediately, in the aftermath of that, connect with thousands and millions of young people across the country, speaking directly to them rather than just through a medium like TV or newspapers or something like that. Through the use of Twitter and things like that. And I think that's probably the main way that I would say I see the differences with our generation. And yeah, anything else I would say is common themes with other generations, but I think that's the main difference, is that changing the form of communication that we have.
And John, what do you think in terms of how this generation is different?
So a couple of things, just to kind of reset the table here, 70 million people kind of your generation, David and Rachel. I'm not someone who says a generation has to start and end in a particular date, right? It's a group of people who grew up living kind of a common experience influenced by current events. And broadly speaking, I think we're talking about 10 to 25-year-olds, roughly speaking, in America, most educated, most diverse group of Americans we've ever seen. And what I would argue, with a little bit of the context that young people like yourselves don't have yet, is that I'd argue that no generation has dealt with more trauma more quickly in your lives without the promise of hope, right? Without seeing what it feels like when America comes together. So just to not walk you through your life story, but born in the mid-1990s, right on either side of 9/11, but faced very quickly going to school where you're supposed to feel safe, but instead you have, red alert, lockdown drills, the concerns about school shootings, very, very real. 80% of Americans lost 20% of the net wealth. Tens of millions of American children lost their homes, which continues to have a dramatic effect, specifically for young men, in terms of their mental health and the preparedness to develop other relationships. Add to that what I call the whiplash between the seeming normalcy of President Obama versus the reality talk show that became Trump, fueled also by white nationalism and concerns about the climate, school shootings, Black Lives Matter, and George Floyd, just a tremendous amount of chaos and stress. I at least remember the Olympics and Americans beating the Russians in 1980. I remember the tragedy when I was in college of the Challenger disaster and how we came together in after 9/11 as well. Your generation hasn't had that moment, and that makes it unique. And rather, though, I think than melting like the snowflakes, as some people like to label the generation as, the chaos and the pressures from the outside world have made you harder, perhaps angrier, but more determined and motivated to do the things that David just talked about. So I think that's unique, not having the positive aspects to balance the stress and the trauma.
And just to piggyback off that a little bit with David, in your experience having organized after a mass tragedy and bringing a community together that was not only isolated to Parkland, but across the country, getting, high school students and young people all over to become a part of this movement, this is what turned to be like a global movement. And you talk about the level of connectedness. So can you walk us through a little bit how social media played a role in connecting the groups that were able to come together for that movement?
Yeah, I mean, it enabled us to connect with, different chapters across the country that started to form, that were doing marches and everything like we called for doing after the shooting, when we wanted to have just initially a march in Washington, D.C., and then enabled people to have their own march in their own city if they wanted to, where we ended up because of, the use of the internet and stuff like that, we ended up having over 800 marches, with one on every continent except Antarctica. That was in large part enabled by social media and people hearing about it. And I think even more so feeling like they're part of the movement, and not just that they're, people that are observing from the outside, but that they were able to be part of it. They were able to sign up on their website. They were able to go and apply for the permits in their cities. It's very decentralized. And I think that was one of the kind of defining characteristics that social media enabled that's different from the past. The other thing that I guess I wanted to say that comes from social media too, going back to what John said as well, is that I think while our generation is the most connected generation ever before, and that we're able to get on Twitter or, any of these different social media platforms and talk about these things, we're also one of the most isolated. I think that there's a lot, especially with the pandemic, but even before that, social media has taken up a lot of younger people and people of all ages times, but especially younger people, where it's a really important developmental stage at this time in our lives, where we're just on social media a lot of the time rather than being in person. And when you throw in there the fact that there are all of these algorithms that, you know, have engagement, you know, based ranking that promote whatever the most viral thing is, regardless of whether it's true or not, or especially regardless of whether or not it's good for society, what we end up with a lot of the time is a common narrative in the general, you know, community on Twitter or wherever it might be, of just anger and fear. Because we see again and again, as we saw from some of the Facebook papers that came out and stuff like that, that is some of the stuff that spreads fastest and easiest. And when you mix in, you know, disinformation or misinformation with that, you end up a lot of the time with a generation that feels an enormous weight on its shoulders, because it is there, of school shootings, elected officials not being there to protect us, you know, neither Democrats or Republicans at this point really showing up to protect us in any substantial way, honestly. In the way that we need it to stop kids from being shot in their schools or in their communities. And when we have that, what kind of results from that is the mental health epidemic that we're seeing right now in the United States. Young people having extreme anxiety and depression and things like this. And I mean, the data speak for this, as John will tell you from the Harvard Youth Public Opinion poll. The numbers are shocking, with the numbers of young people that are experiencing, you know, thoughts of self-harm, depression, and anxiety is, I see it as basically unprecedented.
You know, with regard to that point about it being unprecedented, I wonder if, and John, I don't know if from going back, you know, years, you're able to identify any trends in this way, but the social media that is potentially perpetuating the mental health crisis, is it also allowing people to be more vocal in expressing that they have mental health concerns in the first place? Like, does it go both ways?
I don't know if social media is necessarily playing a driver in that, but I do feel, and I do hear, and do believe that Gen Z is just more comfortable using their voice, period. You know, and whether that is you take the most introverted, and I write about this boy in Fight, a boy named Moses from California, who's from Inglewood. He goes to school in mostly an all-white school in Culver City, but the most introverted young man who can stand up when he sees racism perpetuated at his school, even though he's like too shy to participate in a focus group, he'll stand up and confront racism there. He's comfortable using his voice. And so many young people are comfortable not stigmatizing stress and depression and the PTSD that especially people in African-American communities talk about, specifically around gun violence and some of the other parts of their kind of family and neighborhood lives. So I don't know if social media is playing a role in that or not, but I do know that, and I discovered this kind of organically, Rachel. I would be conducting focus groups expected to talk about education or climate, and I just start with, tell me about yourself, you know, and I'd hear the fear and the mental health, and it would basically overcome the rest of my time with these people. So they're very comfortable doing it. One, however, to really zero in on mental health for a second, there is just strong evidence that this is a Gen Z issue that is exacerbated over the last handful of years relative to millennials. So from 2000 to 2008, there was a period of relative stability in the number of suicide deaths among young people in America. And beginning in the early 2010s, we started to see it increase up, and then it really increased even to a 47% increase in the last handful of years relative to the first period of this decade. So as Gen Z is coming of age, we're also seeing a significant spike, very sadly, in suicide in every single state in America, with New Hampshire borders up to the north being a state that has resulted in the most suicide deaths. So I think it's a combination of young people being more comfortable talking about it, but also the data from the CDC indicates also the increasing number of recent deaths.
So to zoom out a little bit, John, in the book, you highlight 5 what you call landmark events that have come to shape Gen Z's politics and their understanding of the world around them, one of which directly impacted David's life. So those were Occupy Wall Street, the Trump presidency, Parkland, the murder of George Floyd, and Greta Thunberg's school strikes for climate. I'm wondering if you could tell us a little bit about how you came to identify these 5 as the 5 most critical.
Sure. Well, it's what I do in polling, Rachel, right, is both art and science. So I'm going to tell you there's a lot of art in this, right, in terms of, the kind of determining things, right? But it's obviously kind of driven by data. And it was, 5-10 years ago where I saw these dramatic shifts in our Harvard data around views related to capitalism and inequality and injustice. And clearly a decade ago in 2011, you couldn't hide, literally from the tents in the Harvard Yard to everywhere on social media, the concerns about capitalism and by Occupy Wall Street. But what's interesting is Occupy Wall Street was actually a movement gifted from a silent generation, to millennials, and then handed down to Gen Z. So a decade ago, as you're 10, 12 years old, your first entry point into politics is really a debate about the super wealthy, the 1% versus everybody else. So it has an outsized impact in terms of the way in which young people think about politics. And clearly, Bernie Sanders offering putting life into that movement from a kind of the top down, not just the bottom up, but the top down, made it what it is today. That's the first thing. We talked a lot about the chaos around Trump, but let's not forget that it was only the first day in office, right, when he was questioning reality regarding how many people showed up at his inaugural parade and such, and then very, very quickly pulled out of Paris and added Steve Bannon to the National Security Council. These are some of the things we forget. He'd fired Sally Yates, and this is what's happening to the fear that young people were seeing. People were not allowed into the country based upon largely their religion. So politics became very, very tangible. And that was well before even Charlottesville and Las Vegas and then Parkland. David talked a lot about inspiring young people, which was so critical because it taught them to not just protest and march and tweet, but actually showing up. And if it wasn't for young people in 2018, there'd be 10 fewer Democrats in Congress. 2.5 points were added to the overall margin for Democrats, and about 10 seats went from red to blue. And then what I really enjoyed discovering through my research, again at Global Movement, was Greta Thunberg. She was frustrated middle schooler because her classmates and her teachers really weren't paying attention to her. We were just talking about the climate catastrophe that she could so clearly see. And then she read in news reports about how March for Our Lives began to organize school strikes. She goes, let me do that. And she went on her first day. The only person with her that first day was her dad. Her dad took the sign, riding the bike from the street to the parliaments. And then the next day, I think a teacher. And then eventually became to a global movement. And she spoke to more people in New York City than I think anybody in recent memory other than the Pope. Amazing. And then I think most significantly in the last couple of years is clearly the impact that another Gen Zer had, Darnella Frazier, who, if not for her, who was a high school student who just wanted to take her 10-year-old niece or 10-year-old cousin to grab dessert at a local convenience store, stumbled upon the gruesome, brutal murder of George Floyd. And I would argue, if not for Darnella, we don't even know who George Floyd is, because the year before, when there was no Darnella, Minnesota police killed 14 men and women. We don't know who they are. The year before that, we don't know their names. The year before, 13 people were killed at the hands of police. So those 5 events, I think, have influenced the way in which young people are approaching their own life, the lives of the community, and they're also influencing families in the rest of America. Because that, as we know, as we remember, those protests after George Floyd happened during a lockdown, where many families were under the same roof and forced to have some of these difficult conversations. And again, I think that was a big driver in changing the dialogue, changing opinion, and ultimately influencing the presidential election of 2020.
So coming to the election of 2020, there was high youth voter turnout, not just in 2020, but during the 2018 midterms. And in the book, John, and this is to quote you again, you mentioned that whether you praise him or wished he was impeached, it is impossible to overestimate the influence Donald Trump has had on the personal and political development of Gen Z. So I'm wondering if both of you, maybe we can start with David this time, if you think that without Trump officially on the ballot in 2022, that trend will persist.
I don't know. It's difficult to really estimate. I think there's a light. If I had to make the most conservative, I would say I think their turnout is going to be higher than 2014, but I mean that's a pretty low bar. I think what we'll see is likely I don't know, there's always time before the election, right? Like when we started with March for Our Lives, it was in February of 2018, and that was just a couple months before, November. And right now we're in January of 2022. And anything could happen in these next couple of months. But I think the biggest fear that I have is that young people have turned out repeatedly because we were told to. We said, we wanted to get Trump out a lot of the time for many of us, or that we wanted to see change, and our parents and grandparents and everyone said, great, go out and vote. And we did. And we still, because of the filibuster, have seen very little change that directly impacts the issues that young people genuinely care about. They passed an infrastructure bill, and that's great, but I can tell you, I could probably walk up to 9 out of 10 people at school if I was just to pull 10 young people from across the country, I don't think 9 of them would be able to tell me a single thing the infrastructure bill does for them that makes them actually want to turn out and vote. I think the challenge that youth face is that it's a lot easier for us to point out all the ways something is wrong and to vote against something rather than it is to vote for something, because our generation, unfortunately, has lacked as much leadership as I think we've needed, especially in the time since Trump, to meet a lot of the challenges that we face right now. So if I had to make an estimate, I would say it's probably going to be within plus or minus 3 points of 2018 in terms of turnout. That's my estimate.
John, what do you think?
I think that's a pretty good estimate. It's a pretty safe bet, David. So a couple of things. At this stage, when we ask these questions, we see relatively the same level of interest in voting in 22 than we saw than they actually had showed up in 2018, right? So at this point, there is about the same number of people who voted in 2018 ready to vote in 2022. As David said, that came together relatively quickly near the end, inspired by, again, the movements. So anything can happen. 33, that would mean a third vote, 33, 34, 35%, if David's right, and he probably is. But I'm not sure that's sufficient, right? And as optimistic as I am, and as much as I think about Gen Z, I've been thinking a lot about their grandparents and probably great-grandparents, the greatest generation. 70% of the greatest generation sacrificed some significant way, putting themselves mostly in harm's way to save America from fascism, 70%. And I would argue that if 70% of young people turn out in 2022, 2024, they could do the same thing in this country without putting themselves at risk, right? So what that would require is everybody, obviously, who voted to bring, a friend or two, and to really kind of change the dynamic, and to, as difficult as it is, to have that perspective that if a couple more races went a particular way, a little bit more, this happened or that happened around turnout, then it wouldn't be a 50-50 Senate. It'd be, it would be a bigger gap between people who are interested in voting rights and people who aren't, et cetera. And again, these issues that folks care about we can see progress much quicker. So again, that could happen, but unless something dramatic like that happens and that kind of self-sacrifice and faith in the system happens, then we could be prepared to see similar stalemates moving forward.
So,
I think, sorry.
No, go ahead, David.
I just wanted to follow up and say, I think John's totally right. I think because we live in a country that has a non-proportional system of government with the Senate specifically, and the filibuster on top of that, unless young people turn out basically at, a rate 30, much higher than we already have, which is still unprecedented in the way it is, it's going to be way harder for us to make any change, because the states that we need to change, because Gen Z is, disproportionate or liberal and Gen Z, most of those people that do turn out and vote in that way live in the same states. They live in they live in cities, basically. And if we really want to end up changing things, we're going to need to turn out young people to vote in their home states and get them voting as much as possible to rate even higher than happened in 2018 and even higher than happened in 2020. I don't know if that's even possible, but the reality is if we really want to create substantial change and get through the filibuster, or even if we abolish the filibuster, we're going to need to turn out at a way higher rate, unless there are a couple more states that are created or something like that, with some more senators. And that's the kind of battle that we're facing. And on top of that, our generation, as John mentioned, being one of the most diverse in American history, not only faces voter suppression, at being young people in general, with voter signature requirements that can cause your ballot to be thrown out if the signature doesn't match, but also the fact that our generation is going to be disproportionately affected by voter suppression, not just from being youth, but also being the most diverse in American history. And especially seeing what happened recently with the recent vote in the Senate on the voting rights situation, it's not looking too good. And it really scares me, because if we have an entire generation that is turned out at very high rates and is trying to make the system work for them, and the system refuses to work for them because we have a non-proportional system of government where these people are turning out, and frankly, millions of young people going out and saying we shouldn't be shot or in danger in our communities, in our front yards or in our schoolyards or in our classrooms, doesn't change things, and they do turn out to vote. To me, that feels like a canary in the coal mine for the current state of our democracy, because those young people are going to start to look to somebody who can do it, is my fear, if the change does not come from voting in the first place.
So just a few more questions that we can go through sort of rapid fire before we get to the Q&A. But John, in the book, you highlight that at the local level, when it comes to gun control and policing, at least at the local level, some changes have been made in response to activism, while we haven't necessarily seen those at the federal level yet. So I'm wondering how and where you see, and David, I think you might have a response to this too, but how and where do you see Gen Z strategizing when it comes to policy change?
Well, it's, again, as you mentioned, I think Gen Z has done more to already change policy than they may even appreciate. That there are dozens and dozens of police departments and local governments who are policing in a very different way than they did 2 years ago, right? That very, very quickly, David knows better than all of us, the meaningful but not sufficient reforms that Tallahassee made around bump stocks and other restrictions around guns, not sufficient, but at least something. So I think we need to understand that change can happen at every single level in government. And one of the concerns that I have is that relative to baby boomers, millennials who are just a little bit older than Gen Z only have half as much power in Congress as baby boomers did when they were that age, when they were young. So what happened is you had a significant number of mostly conservative, a majority of conservative baby boomers ran for office and have been holding on for decades now. And with the campaign finance system, making it more challenging for people to kind of the challenge us system. And that's one of the reasons that we've got the gridlock and special interest that David knows so well. But the other thing I would say is that we've talked extensively, which is good, about politics, but Gen Z also is using your collective power to influence things beyond politics, right? In terms of the power of your attention when it comes to media and technology, and the power of your pocketbook when it comes to the brands that you're loyal to, the companies and the organizations that you choose to work for and with, et cetera. So again, the cultural force and the political force and the economic force of Gen Z isn't fully appreciated as much as it, I think, will be shortly.
David, do you have anything you want to add there?
I think one of the things that isn't talked about a lot is the different approach that Gen takes, and that I see a lot of the times like memes about how like boomers versus millennials versus Gen Z people handle the workplace, where boomers a lot of the time, in general, would talk about working, 80 hours a week or whatever it might be and being proud of it and things like that. Whereas, we see a lot of these managers and stuff talking about how like Gen Z, like we do not care. If we are not happy with the way something is going in our job or something, we will leave and resign. We do not care. And we'll take that risk. We will not stay in a job for the most part that we hate for decades just because it's a paycheck coming in. We do not care, and we will leave if our conditions are not met. And what that actually makes me kind of hopeful, because I think the real way that progressive politics is going to be supercharged in this country, or one of the best ways it could be, is if there was a kind of rebirth or growth in the labor movement as a result of that mentality that Gen Z takes, because we saw from things like the New Deal Coalition and other things like that, the power of labor in politics. And if we see a resurgence as a result of the pandemic, and unfortunately, or I guess fortunately, people not putting up with unreasonable working conditions, we're going to see a lot more growth of that. We saw again and again how, the CDC changed recommendations in part, or the government has been impacted by businesses basically saying we need workers to come in even if they have COVID, because if we don't, the country's not going to function anymore. And it's been interesting to see other young people talk about the fact that, like, if they say that the country would grind to a halt in 10 days if people couldn't come to work because of COVID, stands to reason if there's a general strike or something like that, that workers could get a lot more better working conditions in this country and not just keep making the top of the 1% even more wealthy in the first place. But that's what makes me a little bit hopeful. But I do fear for the future that change is not going to come quick enough because of the non-proportional nature of our government, and young people just completely losing hope that change can even come in any form from our system of government.
Okay, and then the last question before we flip to Q&A, I'm wondering if each of you can describe Gen Z in 3 words.
Who's gonna go first?
John, you
okay. I'm gonna fearful, angry, motivated.
David?
I was gonna say fearful for sure, really, really angry, and motivated but exhausted.
That's good.
Okay. So
that's like 15 words, but that's still good. Yeah.
Well, thank you. Okay, so we do have a few questions, but please feel free to continue sending them in if you haven't already. We would love to hear from everyone who's watching. But to kick us off, we have a question that says, if millennials are the children of helicopter parents, how does Gen Z relate to their parents and grandparents? More importantly, are there policy or political downsides to raising the intensity of conflict between generations?
Okay, so Fascinating question. A couple of, I think there's a couple of ways I think about that. What's really interesting about this, I think, this conversation today is we're talking about the gaps in generations in terms of how they see America. When the oldest millennial, who's Pete Buttigieg, Secretary Buttigieg, is essentially the oldest millennial. It just turned 40. He was one of our first students actually who helped with a survey, getting it off the ground when he was an undergrad here. When it was the first time for that generation to vote, they voted in equal numbers, Democrat and Republican, for Bush and Gore in 2000. There were some Gen Xers clearly in that cohort as well, but the country was evenly divided by generation. In fact, it were older Americans who were slightly more progressive than younger Americans at that point. So it's a fallacy to believe that just because you're young, you're going to, automatically be voting a particular way. It's the culture that influences those decisions. So that's kind of where it started. But today there are very few subgroups within the electorate that are more divided than generations. So as an example, the 4 key states in the presidential election, Arizona, Michigan, Pennsylvania, and Wisconsin, Donald Trump won the votes of every one of those citizens over the age of 45. He won. If only 45-year-olds and up could vote, he would still be president. It wasn't Biden won based mostly on the votes of thousands of young people under 30. He won that group by over 20 points in every one of those states. People in the 30s voted for him in the low double digits, high single digits. So it is, and a similar thing happened in Georgia with the runoff. So it is that generation gap fueled by younger people that elected Biden. So we can see that there are different political divides there. I don't think, though, it would be helpful to further create conflict, especially at this time in our country. And one of the things that I took a lead from Harvard, we were most proud of on that Biden campaign, was that we were able to build some bridges between younger people and their grandparents, essentially. And we narrowed the degree to which Donald Trump won older voters over the age of 65. So the best things happen, and there's a lot of examples in Europe and in South America around these protests that David talks about, started by young people, but joined by other generations. And I think that's what we should be hoping for, is for younger people to continue to influence, to continue to open up the eyes and the minds of their parents and grandparents to the injustice and inequality that they're seeing, just like they did in 2020 around race.
Okay. Do any of you have thoughts on what those of us from earlier generations can do to support Gen Z in their activism efforts?
David.
I would just say, if you have them, listen to your kids for one, and treat them like adults. And I would say the other way too is just letting them kind of lead themselves. I think the biggest thing is that I see a lot of the time is that young people aren't going to get involved in activism because their parents tell them to necessarily, or ever. I've never heard a story of a younger person getting involved in March for Our Lives or any other form of activism because their parent was like, oh, you need to go and do this. I think more than anything, the best organizers that I've seen oftentimes come from households that do not support them, actually. They have conservative parents, they have parents that do not agree with them a lot of the time. But I think the best way that you can support that is just listen to us and ask, what can you do to help us? Whether that's showing up at a March for Our Lives, event like we did in Washington, D.C., and helping your kids get there, or whether it's helping provide transportation to them and a group of friends if they're going to lobby their state capitol, or help volunteering on a young person's campaign and just listening to them and letting them lead. That's what I would say, along with donating, obviously, to their efforts like March for Our Lives and stuff like that.
Rachel, can I add?
Yeah.
Even more general, I think is I hear a lot of frustration. I've been getting, you know, when I'm asked to speak to a group of parents, for example, on mental health, I'll cite some statistics and share some of the, you know, similar sort of insights. But I have to talk about politics and the connection that politics has with stress. And I remember doing that for the first time and kind of walking off the stage and kind of apologizing, you know, sheepishly for talking about politics. And it was a mental health counselor. She said to me, "Don't ever apologize. We need to hear this and we need to talk about politics." And too many families and too many schools and too many groups shy away from it because it can create conflict. And all that does is it further normalizes the bad behavior that we're seeing and doesn't prevent an opportunity for young people to understand, debate, and put these kinds of issues into context, which then could lead them into a pretty dark rabbit hole on the internet. So like welcoming conversations just like this. I've had thousands of these in my life, right, with young people, and they always leave me more optimistic. Even when they disagree, they're not generally disagreeable. They want really to solve these issues. Democrats and Republicans want to afford college. Democrats and Republicans don't want to do 2 or 3 or 4 side hustles, you know, to afford to live in an apartment in Boston or Cambridge or dozens of other places. So there's much more in common that this generation has. And if we provide them more space and opportunity to have these conversations, I think everybody wins.
Okay, so I think we have 2 more questions. This one is actually something that I was wondering if you guys could talk a little bit about. And I know the book isn't necessarily aimed at driving solutions, but I'm wondering with regard especially to mental health, if you have any suggestions of ways similar to the last question of how, you know, older people can help this generation with regard to mental health, both not just older generations, but Gen Z themselves. Like what type of conversations should people be having?
David, you want to start? David has a very, very thoughtful, I think, response to questions like these, and he talked about that, frankly, in the forward. So, David, you want to take it first?
Yeah, I think the general answer that you would typically hear to this question is something along the lines of, you know, talk to each other more and have, you know, like just talk about how you're feeling and stuff like that. And while I think that's important, I think it actually I think it's part of this problem that we have a lot of the time right now, where instead of addressing systematic issues that everybody is experiencing in one way or another, whether it's wealth inequality, whether it's violence at school or in someone's community that is brought on by systematic racism, injustice, environmental injustice, or you know, any other form of injustice, I think the bigger thing that I would talk about is the fact that these things, shouldn't be happening in the first place. Kids should not have to be fearing for their lives in schools or in their front yards or anywhere in one of the richest country in the world that has a extremely high level of gun violence in comparison to other high income countries. There are other countries that have guns that do not have anywhere near the level of violence that we have. And young people as a result don't have anywhere near as much fear. And the point that I'm getting at is I don't think it's best to treat symptoms. I think it's better to address the cause in the first place and acknowledge that the fact that there are so many young people that have gun PTSD from gun violence in their communities and in their schools is unacceptable in the first place. And the fact that I think a lot of the time that activism in and of itself can be a form of almost societal therapy in some ways, because it makes people come out and address the trauma that they faced and realize that they're not alone in this. So instead of just giving you the generic answer of saying, just talk about it, it's going to be fine. I think you should talk about it, but you should know that this is not normal. There's no amount of mindfulness or meditation or anything like that is going to frankly, unfuck our political system in the first place. It's not going to necessarily stop a war or, you know, stop a recession. What's going to stop that is by good, bright people getting involved in politics and changing it themselves and realizing, well, they can't change the entire system is built up by people. And if we get enough people involved to change it, then the system will change.
Brilliant. Thank you, David. Can I offer up one tactical piece of advice that many may not know? But I think there's a window here, a relatively short window, created by the pandemic, and the billions of dollars of relief funds that every city and town in America is receiving, including every single school district from the federal government. In many places that has not yet been earmarked. So one thing that all of us who are voters can do is to ask our school committees, our superintendents, those who are involved in education, to ensure that those funds that the federal government is providing to local authorities are spent in the best way to provide the resources that are required to create programming and to create additional opportunities for young people to have conversations like this, but also to get counseling and mentorship if required. The Biden administration does have money set aside for mental health, but I think that if all of us follow up with our local representatives to make sure that's being spent appropriately, that's something specifically I think we can do. There isn't a place in America I can go when I ask what you would do if you were superintendent or president even of the country, and people say, I need more social workers, I need more psychologists, I need more access to resources. Young people are telling us that.
Okay, and then lastly, thank you both for those thoughtful answers. Lastly, to wrap us up, we got a question that asked if you have any other suggestions for further reading on this topic, because they said this is the first book they've heard of that specifically focuses on Gen Z.
Well, I know there were, Gen Z is only in their early 20s, right? The oldest. So there isn't a lot of material because the story is developing, honestly, in real time, literally in real time. I mean, the George Floyd and the 2020 election happened, after I was done with the first draft, basically, of the book. So it's happening in real time, not a lot of material. I do think a great resource, in addition to everything that Rachel, you do, give you a plug, you're the first, I think, national reporter to cover this generation, right? To make it a major part of your focus. I don't know, but there
are definitely other reporters that I could name some of them too. I mean, I think a lot of what Teen Vogue is doing, while it may be, focused on Teen Vogue, they do write, focused on teens, they do write a lot about Gen Z. So I would look there, but I mean, thank you.
You're welcome. Hopefully you're not the last, right? But Charlotte Alter from Time Magazine wrote a terrific book about millennials, so pretty close. And it's called, what is it called? The Ones We've Been Waiting For. And it's an excellent book, and it has similar themes, and it profiles the kinds of people who are leaders of millennials. And those are the folks who are running for lieutenant governor in Massachusetts and for Congress, and other places around America. That's a good book, Charlotte Alter's. And I know that's available at Harvard Bookstore. I know that. Rachel, what else do you think? Or David?
Books wise? Yeah. Sorry, David.
I was just going to say, I don't really have any because as John said, the story is still happening right now. And all the books that I know are either about gun violence statistics, making change, or American history. So yeah.
Yeah. Books wise, I'm not so sure, but I think that there's not so many journalists who focus on this generation, but there are some. And I think people like NBC is doing a lot of work on internet culture as it pertains to Gen Z. And Taylor Lorenz, who writes for the New York Times, writes about Gen Z and tech. She writes about TikTok a lot. But yeah, I think, this is as both John and David said, an area that's developing and one that I plan to keep paying close attention to. So I hope you'll all continue to join in paying close attention as well. But
two other people real quick, sorry. Juana Summers from NPR does a terrific job. Laura Krantz, Boston Globe, also does a great job covering a lot of the cultural aspects of Gen Z. Sorry, those are other people that I'm learning a lot from.
Yeah, and do you guys have any podcast recommendations? That was another question that was about this topic.
No, sorry, not right now. I just been so focused on my job here. I haven't been able to expand my horizon so much.
Although, sorry. John, maybe that's an idea for HPOP.
I like it. I like it. I like it. So HPOP is our Harvard Public Opinion Project. So, which David served as a member of. So yeah, this is helpful. And I don't know, I'm trying to find ways to tell the story in other creative ways. So stay tuned. Stay tuned.
Well, first of all, thank you so much to the Harvard Bookstore for hosting this conversation. Thank you, John, and thank you, David, for engaging in this conversation, for inviting me to be a part of this. I'm so grateful to have been able to talk with you guys, as this is something that I think the three of us think a lot about on a daily basis, but I'm so glad that there were other people who were interested in having the conversation with us as well. So thank you all. I hope that this served as, while we talked about a lot of the conflict and a lot of the crises, that there were some points of optimism to take as you go into the rest of your evening. So thank you. And yes.
Just echoing Rachel to say thank you to John, David, and Rachel for your time discussing these important and timely topics. Thank you all for tuning in and showing up for authors, publishers, indie bookselling, and our incredible staff at Harvard Bookstore. If you would like to support John in the bookstore, click the link in the chat to purchase Fight. We sincerely appreciate your support. Thanks so much and have a great evening, everyone.
Thank you.